It began with imagination and a pair of dice.
It was a social experience. A group of friends gathered to tell a story together. That's something that no one had ever seen before.
And it merged our world with theirs.
You've got action, you've got romance, you've got adventure, exploration, and it can go on like a soap opera for as long as you want it to go on.
Some people would fight it.
Dungeons & Dragons was heavy metal before heavy metal was heavy metal. I mean, it was the thing that people were really afraid of.
And others would embrace it.
Well, Baldur's Gate, wow, why was it so successful? You know, it clicked on a lot of things and just did them right. So if you're a D&D fan, here was a great way to go in and play a game where you could basically test out some of your ideas about tactics and that sort of thing.
But it altered the course of the gaming industry forever. This is the story of Dungeons & Dragons. The snowy winters of Lake Geneva, Wisconsin provide long hours for indoor entertainment. And in 1970, this perfect setting brings together two people and one incredibly unique idea.
Dungeons & Dragons came out of a long line of wargaming. Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson were two different figures who led their own kind of local wargaming clubs.
Where they would play big games of miniatures with little toy soldiers on tables.
Both Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson were getting a little bit bored, and they're both very creative people, and they were looking for kind of the next step. Both of them independently started doing games based on kind of medieval fantasy settings.
Somebody decided to attack a castle with a small party by going up through the dungeon, and that somehow sparked this thought that you could run a game a little bit differently with one person being a dungeon master.
And the game that will become known as Dungeons & Dragons begins to evolve.
Between them came up with the idea of, hey, you know, it isn't just about how fast and far this guy can move and how far he can fire an arrow and how hard he can swing a sword, but how about if we give these people, these characters, these little lead miniatures, some personality and some opportunities to talk about stuff and talk to each other, and you know, all of a sudden you've got a whole new game, a whole new game type.
Instead of playing armies, you played a single person. And that was the real step. I mean, instead of moving pieces around a board, you became a person inside a world. It was all in their minds. You know, they were imagining everything as it happened, but it was really a world that they were wandering through.
So it all started out as miniature stuff and then turned into something that I don't think anybody saw how big it was going to get.
Gary Gygax sees an opportunity and decides to publish and sell the game himself.
The early success of Dungeons & Dragons was very much a snowball effect. They published it locally. They had some distribution, but it was really college students that spread it. People would go to college, come back at break and say, hey, this game, I found this game, you guys have to play it. And it really spread by word of mouth, underground, but really, really strongly. I mean, by the end of the decade, it was a cultural phenomenon in the way that certainly no war game ever had been before.
To satisfy a growing fan base, in 1979, Gary releases an update called Advanced Dungeons & Dragons.
Took the game to a whole nother level, and we all just went berserk when these books came out. Big hardcover books, just packed full of just all sorts of cool stuff. And the game became more complicated. There was more options of things you could do to your character.
While a new generation of gamers begin exploring D&D, a little invention known as the computer begins piquing interest across the country.
Without D&D, there wouldn't be any computer games. Okay, there might be like Pong or something, but I mean, everybody who's driving a Ferrari in this business, and everybody who isn't driving a Ferrari, for that matter, ought to get down and, turn northwards towards Wisconsin every day, and just say a little prayer of thanks.
You could do things with computers that you couldn't conceive of in the real world. They seemed simple, but it's like you had control over this new environment in a way that, you know, you didn't in your ordinary life.
Here was a way to, you know, for us to realize all these fantasies that we had lived all those years, or that we had imagined, I guess. We were now able to live them. And when all these sort of, you know, geeky guys started programming and you know, all of a sudden, I mean, wow, Ultima, Might and Magic, you know, Bard's Tale, I mean, you name it. I mean, it all comes back to people recreating their D&D campaigns at some level.
Dungeons & Dragons is one of three things that really sort of jump-started the game industry. I mean, you can't talk about D&D without going to Tolkien. So these kids read Tolkien, and then they created their own Tolkien-esque world with Dungeons & Dragons. It stands to reason when you sort of stand back now and look at the line that it was exactly these kinds of people who, when the new technology, when computers came along, it was them. It was these people that were playing these games. So naturally, since they had just created a paper game based on Tolkien, they're then going to try to create a digital game based on Dungeons & Dragons, which is based on Tolkien. And what you find, literally, from 1977 to 1995, is that everybody who was developing games, not everybody, but, you know, most of the people that we talked to, which was quite a few people, all said, love Tolkien, you know, love D&D, and then needed to recreate that on the computer. And it was just over and over and over and over and over again.
Dungeons & Dragons continues to shape the future of gaming. But a tragedy will soon focus an angry public eye on this new pastime.
Then, since it's a role-playing game, you'll see people dressed up in full garb. Well, then it gets creepy if you don't really understand, like, this is sort of part of, you know, this is part of the experience. And there was a hysteria about that. Dungeons & Dragons was heavy metal before heavy metal was heavy metal. I mean, it was the thing that people were really afraid of.
After a decade of relative obscurity, Dungeons & Dragons is about to reach new levels of exposure. But not all of it is good.
Dungeons & Dragons has been the center point for a lot of anger throughout the years.
I remember my mother was just unbelievably scared that I was playing this game that destroyed people's minds. It drove you mad. I mean, if you get that deep into your imagination and you start pretending you're someone else and you start, you know, wielding a sword as you play this game and dressing up and speaking funny, I think people were worried that you know, kids were going to get caught up in, you know, demonic, you know, anti-religious stuff or go crazy, all of which is crazy.
And then if you really understand that it's a game about stories, and it's a game of fantasy, and it's a game that essentially needs to be played with other people, you can't really play it by yourself and have fun, some of that fear goes away, because you realize your kid really isn't, you know, Lothar the pagan wizard.
But the intense public scrutiny only helps Dungeons & Dragons find a new audience.
I'd say the recognition of it as a potentially dangerous, you know, satanic thing probably helped it. I mean, if you're a kid or a young male, you know, anyone under 30 really, you know, having the establishment say, hey, this is dangerous, you know, you're going to take another look. You know, it's like, if you can make your parents a little disturbed that you're playing a game, it's like, hey, that's cool, let's try it out.
D&D is being played in imaginations everywhere.
I remember when I started at TSR, I think the received wisdom that we had something like 15 million active players on an ongoing basis at that time. That was back in the mid-'80s, I guess. And that's a pretty big chunk of people.
Due to its rising popularity, TSR, the company Gary Gygax used to publish Dungeons & Dragons, decides to license a series of computer games using the complex Dungeons & Dragons rule set. Strategic Simulations Incorporated, or SSI, takes players into a familiar adventure called the Pool of Radiance.
Yeah, I was working at TSR when the license got signed with SSI, and the games were certainly very successful. I thought they were such amazingly faithful recreations of the D&D experience.
The game allows players to move a party of characters through a dungeon, just as if they were in a real game of Dungeons & Dragons, but without the need for a dungeon master.
At the time the SSI games came out, I was just getting into computers. I was a teenager, and I started picking up the Gold Box games and a few of their other titles because it was just a lot of fun. The SSI games were nice because it was like playing a D&D module, because I would play for, you know, a few weeks or a month, and then I'd want to move on to something else. And here was a module just like a D&D module where there was a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I could play my D&D party, and my friends would come over and they'd start their own parties, and we'd have our different save discs. And we would take notes and pass them on to each other. It was almost like being in an adventurers club where people would say, oh, hey, you know, when you get down to level 16, go behind the gold door, but, you know, don't attack the wizard because he'll blow you away. You know, it was a lot of fun. It provided almost a sort of live gaming